Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. As the pandemic's impact, as well as a global skills shortage, continues to cause double disruption, governments and employers need problem solvers more than ever. So this week, we're putting on our critical thinking caps and finding out just what is being done to equip the thinkers of the future. The term critical thinking is used to describe an educational goal, and it goes back more than a century when it was called reflective thinking. It was defined then as persistent and careful consideration of any belief or form of knowledge. In detail, critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and then action. According to the World Economic Forum, critical thinking is an essential condition for rapid and deep learning and thinking. Salah Khalil has founded the Macat International company, which measures critical thinking and is distilling the core components into an innovative learning framework into the 6 fundamental skills needed for effective critical thinking. And they are problem solving, analysis, creative thinking, interpretation, evaluation, and reasoning. And the truth is, if you're waiting for a crisis but not ready for it, then it may well be too late to solve it. Critical thinking is connected to rational thinking, and its leading exponent, Professor Steven Pinker, has created a critical thinking toolkit, which he hopes will help us all make better decisions. It's time, he says, to start thinking about thinking. He believes that while we live in an era of breathtaking scientific discovery, we also live in an era of fake news, quack cures, conspiracy theories, and post-truth rhetoric. And that's why the need for critical and rational thinking has grown significantly. The latest research by the World Economic Forum estimates that by 2030, at least 85 million people will need to be upskilled or reskilled if the global economy is to avoid losing $8.5 trillion in GDP as a result of artificial intelligence, automation, changing demographics, and globalisation. These estimates are quite conservative when considering that the International Labour Organization and the World Bank project a third of the current global workforce of 3.7 billion people will need critical thinking to help them deal with more complex work environments. Critical thinking and its benefits can be traced back thousands of years. The methodology named after Greek philosopher Socrates, the Socratic method, is one of the earliest critical thinking instruction tools known to man. Centuries later, Roman Emperor Marcus, the philosopher Aurelius, would warn in his meditations that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. Fast forward past Galileo, Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King, and countless others, we're still curious about understanding the ways in which critical thinking can truly benefit us all. Someone who can help us learn more is Salah Khalil. He is the founder and chief executive officer of Macat International, a company that develops academic content in the social sciences and humanities. Salah, welcome to The Agenda. Tell us more about what critical thinking is.
Well, critical thinking, in short, is thinking about thinking. So it is the careful thinking directed by a goal. So essentially, what you have is a process to help one make up our mind about what we believe and what we do. It is self-guided, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective as well. The largest body of literature on critical thinking can be found in 3 major disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, and education. Each of these disciplines have a different conception or definition of critical thinking, For example, philosophy defines critical thinking as perfections of thought, or the perfect critical thinker, or the best critical thinking. Psychology is more interested in the actions and behaviors critical thinkers do, and education is more interested in information processing, where it's kind of like a pyramid, where at the bottom of the pyramid you have regurgitating or just repeating what one's learned. One learns without understanding it. Although these three disciplines disagree in definition, they all agree that critical thinking is a set of skills and behaviors, and that how it becomes relevant to the everyday user. It's something that we need to make wise choices, to make better decisions, to actually analyze things and identify opinions, identify misinformation, really help us develop not just in our professional life, but our educational life and our personal life as well.
Now, I'm looking at the latest research by PwC, Korn Ferry, the World Economic Forum, and they are estimating that in about 8 years, 85 million people will need to be upskilled or reskilled if the global economy is not going to lose trillions of dollars in GDP as a result of artificial intelligence, automation, changing demographics and globalisation. So how can critical thinking come in here to help with that upskilling and prepare people for the huge changes that are going to happen?
Many of the skills that we're using in the current economy, machines will probably do them better in the future. And if that's the case, these skills will decay with time. So it would not be sensible to invest in skills and invest heavily in those skills that will decay with time. You should be focused and focus your investment on skills that will not decay with time. And critical thinking is one of those skills. Not just because I'm saying it, this is because the World Economic Forum says that the top 10 skills in 2025, 2030, 50%, at least 50% of those skills are critical thinking skills.
And you've also connected critical thinking with pulling people out of poverty, haven't you?
Absolutely. If you look at China, for example, and what they have done in terms of pulling almost 900 million people out of poverty. That's almost 1 billion people. That's a very, very large number. So the way they did this was very interesting, and it's definitely a real example of how politicians work together to maximize social benefit. So in certain villages where it was not possible to connect the village to electricity or power generation or roads, they actually moved the whole village to a new village where it's easier to connect, and therefore creates an opportunities for employment, opportunities to move up the social scale and develop as human beings and remove themselves out of poverty. So how did they do this? Well, why did they choose this idea? I can assure you that there were a lot of problem-solving experts, a lot of analysis experts, a lot of creative thinking experts, a lot of interpretation experts, a lot of evaluation experts, and a whole load of reasoning and justification behind this strategy. All those skills make up critical thinking. And this is a true and real example of how China does not only impact its whatever happens within its borders, but actually can have a global impact on this crisis if it puts its mind to it.
I'm wondering if people had applied critical thinking more to the treatment of the pandemic, we might have perhaps ended this pandemic a little earlier. Was this a perfect place for an example of critical thinking?
This is a really, really good question, because it's the same as the crises that everyone is projecting to happen in 2030, which is the skills gap. Imagine if we 10 years ago, we had known about COVID happening and what kind of preparations we would have done. The vaccines would have been ready, lockdowns would have had enough research to understand when to lock down, when to open, how to do it, how long is it for, and really not let people go through the suffering they went through by losing close family members and not having the ability to say goodbye to them properly. So we could have avoided so many things. But that aside, even if we didn't have the luxury of 10 years before the pandemic happens and knowing about it and planning for it, even when the pandemic happened, there were a lot of decisions that were made that actually were the opposite of critical thinking. And people were going by trial and error rather than reasoned and well-structured approaches towards thinking, consideration. And, one big aspect of critical thinking is moral thinking. And that's really, really important in today's world. We need more moral thinking because good thinking will will help you become a better moral thinker, because you don't need to lie, you don't need to hide things if you think through things properly.
Salah Khalil, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Still to come here on The Agenda. With misinformation now rampant, I find out how universities are helping students question the superficial facts of the future. Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. When it comes to training the next generation of successful leaders, it is being widely argued that schools should switch to teaching what is called the 4 C's. They are critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. But are they enough to equip them with those tools that they might need in life? I'm joined by Lord Knight, former UK Education Minister. Lord Knight, the 4 C's, is that enough? Would that work?
I think it's a really important start. If you talk to employers, particularly those employers with higher wages that they're paying, that are in sectors like the digital economy, where we know that there's going to be a big future growth in work, what they want more than anything are humans that they can employ who can compete effectively with machines. And that competitive advantage that humans have is on the basis broadly of those 4 C's of collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity.
So can I pin you down a bit here, Jim? Because we have been talking about the inexorable march of technology and the new challenges. How do you prepare young people for those new technologies without losing the foundations of education, reading, writing, etc.?
Well, in my mind, we have become over preoccupied by academic knowledge, and we've not thought enough about how we apply that knowledge and some of the other rounder skills that need to go with that.
Is this what you mean by unlearning?
Yes, to an extent, that's right. I think the young people that I talk to, they are becoming pretty good at the majority pretty good at sitting tests in large sports halls on tiny little desks with paper and pen. That's a pretty specific skill that they're never going to use again in their working lives. And recalling knowledge that in the end machines are going to be better at recalling. And they've got to kind of unlearn that that's what education is. We've all got to unlearn that and go, yes, in being able to read and write confidently, being numerate and confident with science knowledge. Those are all really important things to equip us for our future.
So relearning, digital progress, new technologies, robots, where does that leave the arts and playtime for young people?
They're really essential. You know, I'm afraid, you know, I'm of the view that the metaverse has the potential to kill off humanity. If we're all trapped on screens all day and we're not connecting with each other and we're not connecting with nature, then I think we get into a really bad place. The arts are the best way that we've so far found to connect with each other, to connect with our emotions. Sport is a really important way of learning how to work together towards a common goal and to take some physical risk. Those are essential for a broad and balanced curriculum that should be at the heart of every school.
And that's true, especially in Scandinavian countries, isn't it? The importance of play, of time away from the classroom for the child's development. And you acknowledge that sort of importance. And I wonder whether curriculums in the UK and Europe are taking note of that.
Well, certainly I think in my country here in England, we are behind the curve on that. Play-based learning is something that's pretty embedded everywhere you go in the early years of education. And then as, you know, and the great Sir Ken Robinson, who sadly died last year, you know, he talked about how as you get older and go through school, gradually we just start to educate from the neck upwards. We forget about educating for dance, for sport, for creativity, because we're just focused on that academic, that sort of cognitive development. And we're missing out a lot. What play offers is the opportunity to learn through failure, through trying again and again and collaborating with each other. There's huge opportunity attached to play-based learning. And I think the reality is often in the world of work, we do a lot of that. You know, it's possible to misinterpret that in terms of people playing when they should be working, but there is playful working, which is highly productive.
Finally, can critical thinking be contagious? If you're leading a team, if you're leading a school, and you're thinking along these lines, will people follow you, do you think? Will people listen? Will people copy you?
I believe so. I think if we're talking and an idea is sparked of something that you've not really thought of before because someone's thought about the problem differently, they've been creative in the way that they've thought about things, they've interpreted things differently, then that sparks something in you and you go, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's a bit like that other thing that I was thinking about the other day. And then you start to join up the dots of different bits of knowledge that we all hold in isolation and create something really exciting. You know, it's a bit like the imaginal cells in the final metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly. They sit separately, they're separate DNA from the rest of the caterpillar, but then they start to hum on the same frequency as each other. And out of that, the beautiful winged butterfly emerges. And that's a metaphor, if you like, for where we can get to if we embed this thinking properly.
A beautiful metaphor. Lord Jim Knight, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.
It's never been more important for students at universities to learn about critical thinking. Anthony McLaren is the Vice-Chancellor of St Mary's University in London, and he has huge experience in education and also of running the Australian education system, and he joins me now. Anthony, are universities aware enough of the importance of critical thinking?
I think many of them are, and I certainly think they should be. I think critical thinking is central to the purpose of what universities are here for.
Is it a new concept?
I don't think it's a new concept at all. And at St Mary's, we're a Catholic university, and we draw on that intellectual tradition. And, you know, for us, we go back certainly to Thomas Aquinas and his approach, where he listed every argument, and then against every argument, listed those arguments which would be against that argument. So constantly evaluating, testing, making sure that arguments stand up, testing what the opposition to them is, what alternative theories there might be, and then arriving at a conclusion about the way forward.
So critical thinking teaches you one side, but then you must consider the other.
Yeah, and maybe there'll be more than two. It's about synthesizing, experiencing, understanding a whole variety of arguments, learning to evaluate them critically. In other words, not simply taking them at face value, learning to understand what might be determining those arguments, and then using your intellect to evaluate, balance, and reach a conclusion, which both can guide you in terms of what you might believe to be true or what you might believe to be right, but also guide you in terms of action. It isn't simply an intellectual exercise. It can be and should be a guide to action in the real world.
People would summarize it as thinking out of the box, and I've never quite known what that means. So perhaps you could explain a little more about that.
I think the thinking out of the box idea is the recognition that our thinking can be conditioned by habits, by a kind of mental laziness sometimes, or, and I think you see this increasingly nowadays, by a sense that our beliefs or our views are so important that they shouldn't be challenged. And so that reluctance to embrace challenge and to embrace a diversity of viewpoints, I think thinking outside the box, in other words, thinking outside those tram lines that your habits and maybe your upbringing have given you, can be, I think, a very important way of looking at particular problems or situations in a new and fresh way, leading to new knowledge.
I saw something recently saying that academia had turned in many places to imbecilia because they were challenging entirely the wrong things. Does that ring true or not?
Well, not at St Mary's. I would certainly say, you might expect me to say that, but I think it's true. I mean, clearly there's a debate in the university world, as you know, there is in the wider society at the moment, about striking that right balance between the freedom of expression for people to express their ideas, new ideas or challenging ideas, and the rights that we all have as individuals to be treated with respect and dignity. And, you know, getting that balance right is not easy. I think sometimes it's presented as in rather simplistic terms. But I think from a university's point of view, there has to be that fundamental recognition that the university tradition has been about freedom of expression and freedom to pursue particular avenues of knowledge. And that's really important for our academics, but it's also important for our students.
Who would you say are the best critical thinkers at the moment? Economists, academics, politicians, well, maybe not politicians, entrepreneurs, philosophers? Who are critical thinkers closest to?
I do think that the underpinning of philosophy is incredibly important. And again, with the tradition that we have at St Mary's, of coming from that Catholic intellectual tradition, it's always struck me that it's very interesting that in the training of Catholic priests, they spend 3 years studying philosophy before they're let loose on theology. So learning how to think even precedes learning how to think what you might regard as the heart of you know, their intellectual formation. However, you mentioned earlier on thinking out of the box, and there's no doubt, if I think about the interface between academia and the commercial world, that, you know, academics, like everyone else, can become trapped in habitual patterns of thinking. Entrepreneurs, because of the way that they approach the world and the way that they seek to solve, often very quickly, real life problems, can play an enormous part. I mean, if you think about the recent developments, particularly here, but in other countries too, in relation to the search for the COVID vaccine, you know, extraordinary partnerships really between the kind of thinking that goes on in academic institutions and the kind of thinking that goes on in commercial or entrepreneurial situations.
I've also read that being open-minded to solutions or ideas other than your own is essential to critical thinking. And having an ego is one of the biggest barriers. In such a narcissistic age, this must be a major hurdle to overcome.
I think that is absolutely right. I know it's actually quite a profound insight that, which critical thinking might share with some of the world's great religious or philosophical traditions. That critical thinking is, at least in part, about overcoming the ego, overcoming the tendency we all have to think we're right, the way we see the world is right. It's the best way of seeing the world. But the dominance now in public communication of social media has led to, I think, in many cases, a situation where the ego is predominating. And of course, that makes people far less willing to accept other points of view, because they hear another point of view, one that perhaps is different to theirs or contradictory, directly contradictory to theirs. And rather than thinking, well, that's another perspective, let me evaluate that, let me see whether I think there's anything of merit there, they take it as a personal attack on them.
Which is why so much social media is poisonous, because people are thinking critically as opposed to critical thinking.
Yeah, thinking critically in that destructive sense of the word. Let's just tear someone down. Let's tear down that viewpoint, or let's silence it altogether because, actually we don't agree and we think it's threatening to us or to me or to my sense of myself, my sense of my ego. I think it's a major issue. And of course, particularly younger students now, these are the so-called digital natives. They've grown up with this. It's not in any sense something they've learned. They've absorbed it. And therefore, part of coming to university now is also learning, I think, to think freshly and think perhaps in ways which social media is not conducive towards.
I agree completely. Anthony McLaren, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Critical thinking is, well, critical because of the predicted future skill shortage in the workplace. Many of the world's leading organizations say that by 2030, there will be a global human talent shortage of more than 85 million people. And, left unchecked, that talent shortage could result in losses of up to $8.5 trillion in unrealized annual revenues. There are a number of key drivers that created and continue to widen the global skills gap. These include globalisation and modernity, demographic changes, COVID, of course, and a shift to an on-demand new economy. Taken together, these forces intensify employment competitiveness and drive the demand for skilling, reskilling, and upskilling. Salah also highlighted how much critical thinking is linked to China, pulling 900 million people out of poverty. And that's proof of how critical thinking can work to create a better future. And with the increasing pace and reach of digital transformation, particularly with the rise and growth of artificial intelligence, human beings will have to work hard to win the skills race by continuously skilling, reskilling and upskilling to remain relevant, employable, and to avoid the condition of being the superfluous human. Therefore, human beings will need to work hard to adapt to a new context of augmented intelligence to achieve the capability of rapid and deep learning and thinking across various domains and within a single domain. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, fighting fraud, why more must be done to tackle a $1 trillion crime. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.